Okay, class, so we're going to get into the study guide. Let me make this PowerPoint presentation a little bit bigger. And we're starting with the term assimilation. And we had done a discussion on this. What does it look like? How does the process of assimilation occur? But I also wrote on the board, and you can see now that I have it in the notes here, that assimilation is when someone who comes from a foreign land or culture becomes absorbed into a culture and learns how to blend into the ways of the predominant society. And you folks all gave wonderful examples of how it happens, in our own families, how we slowly assimilate, how we lose the language, or how we stop cooking the traditional foods, we stop celebrating the traditional holidays. So, it was an excellent discussion. Hopefully, you all remember or were there that day. Uh, Number two, nativism will save until a little bit later because it gets introduced later. White ethnicity, which is number three, all that is white ethnicity, that has to do with the fact that many white people who identify as being white or Caucasian, they are not seen as having an ethnicity. But this lecture was centered around the idea that many of them were assimilated into Anglo American culture and thus had to leave their identities behind. Okay? Number four, which is the early German American settlement, um, it was just talking about how Germans were one of the first non Anglo groups to come into the United States. And they really came because they were religious migrants. They wanted to escape the persecution that they were feeling in their home states, their home country. And they were very different in terms of their geographic their their geographic origin. They came from very many different nations in Germany, very many different kingdoms, and they also practiced different religions. But we could say for the most part, they were Protestant. They were they were Protestant, and then they were Catholics also. Oh, and I showed you one of the religious migrant groups from Germany that still practice, the religion in a very uh, fundamental way, which is the Amish family. And then I have anti-German American sentiment for number five. Let's see. Okay, so what you'll see with not just the Germans, but also with the Irish is that they both um, come into the Americas and they are not welcomed with open arms. There is a nativist sentiment. Now, what is that? Let me make this a little bit smaller so you could see. Nativism is a set of beliefs that centers around favoring the interests of people who are native born to a country, though generally not concerning Native Americans, as opposed to its immigrants. Okay, so it's all about the people who were born here, but like it said, not Native Americans, but like the Anglo Americans who had come before them, and them feeling like they should be entitled to more things than these new immigrants that are coming in. Okay, and both the Irish and the German again felt that rising nativism as they were coming in. And this was an example of how the nativism was acted out. I gave you this story of John Maines, who was a German immigrant and who was tarred and feathered by the Anglos in the village that he stayed in. And this was especially tense during the war because remember when we went to war, it was against Germany, and so a lot of people accused German Americans of being disloyal, that maybe they were spies, and so people targeted individuals like John Maines, and he sued, and the court did not rule in his favor. Um, However, later he was able to appeal it and take it to a higher court, and then they gave him a very small settlement. Okay, um, but other examples that I gave you in class were of Germans who had to stop speaking German, who had to stop giving their children uh, German instruction in the schools, who had to change the names of their streets from German names to more Anglo-sounding names, who had to stop eating their foods to avoid being harassed. And so I made the point at the end that you don't see many traces of German culture here in the US, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that they were forced to assimilate and all the discrimination and harassment that they had experienced. Let's move on to, um, let's see, Alien Enemy Act. Oh, for this one, don't forget that aside from the Japanese, the Germans were also interned. Okay, they were put into concentration camps during World War II. It wasn't just the Japanese. And however, though, the Japanese were interned at higher rates, probably at 5 times the rate that German people were. Um, and so I did tell you a story of a family whose father was interned, the Iserloh family, and what an impact it had on their family. Eventually, they went to go live with Mr. Iserloh in the concentration. I'm sorry, not in the internment camp, um, and eventually they ended up repatriating them, meaning they ended up sending them back to Germany, and they had an awful time in Germany as well because people felt like that they weren't truly German, right? They weren't accepted over there, but they also were not accepted over here. Irish Americans. So Irish immigration, number 6. So Irish immigrant diversity is based on when they entered, where did they settle, what religion were they. Earlier Irish immigrants were Scotch Irish, meaning they were the Scottish people that went into Northern Ireland and settled there, and they were Protestant. So they were Scots Irish and they were Protestant and they were more wealthy. The people that came a little after that were mostly Catholic and more from a lower class. Okay, um, and you could see that the point there, the first wave, 1600 to 1700s, mostly wealthy Protestants that were Irish. Okay, my battery's running out. Hold on. Okay, so in 1840, the first Irish come into Boston's North End. Okay, so that was one of the big groups that is now in Boston. You can't think about Boston without thinking about the Irish. That was the first time they had ever come into the North End. And the reasons they were coming were because of the potato famine. You have a picture here in front of you of an Irish, type potato that had that disease or that fungus that made it so that the potatoes were inedible. And during this time, this was a staple food. So it would be the equivalent to uh, like rice for in Asian countries. Okay, so this wiped out almost all of the Irish people's only form of subsistence and sustenance. Therefore, it it created a widespread famine, and it also created very intense, um, impoverished conditions for most Irish. Okay, and so then the next one is Irish immigration, anti-Irish sentiment. The next one is Irish Americans and nativism. So that is number 7. So the Irish came during the height of the nativist movements, and they were targeted for being Catholic. I know I told you that the first wave of the Irish were Protestant, but later waves were Catholic. The biggest bulk of Irish were Catholic. And you can see here in these pictures that people did not paint them in very favorable lights. And when I mean people, I mean Anglo-Americans did not have a favorable view of Irish Americans. On the left there, you'll see a cartoon that says Contrasted Faces, and it has Florence Nightingale on one side, and then a cartoon depiction of a Irish female on the right side with a title underneath saying Bridget McBruiser, which would be a stereotypical take on an Irish name. And then on the right side, you have an Irishman on a scale alongside a black man. And what this is saying is that for Anglo Americans, blacks and Irish were seen as being equally inferior, and sometimes you would hear people say that the Irish were worse because they didn't know their place, and they tried to make it so that they felt like they were equal to the Anglos. Here's some other cartoons depicting Irish people in negative lights. One of the things that scared Anglo-Americans about Irish were the fact that Irish Americans were gaining power, political power. If that happened, right, in Anglo's minds, they knew that once the Irish figured out how to play the game, so to speak, that they would be able to influence these larger political processes and make it so that the structure favored them just as well. And so that's what they were scared of. On the right, you have a depiction of an Irish immigrant in an ape-like fashion. I think I pointed out in class that Black Americans had also been characterized as apes in cartoons, and people often try to equate it with race, right? They say blacks are like, are like ape-like creatures, but it's not color, it's not, physicality. It's not that black people look like this. It's that white Anglos wanted to characterize them in that way. And this is a perfect example of that, because you have a white person who does not look much different from an Anglo person, an Irish white person, but yet they're characterizing him as an ape. And they were harassed also. Some of their churches were burnt down. Some of these people were violently assaulted in the streets just for being Irish. But the biggest thing was just trying to shut them out of the labor market. They wanted it so that Irish were not able to enjoy the same economic success as Anglo Americans. And I wanted to make this smaller because I know you couldn't see the sign at the bottom, but let me make this, not smaller. Now let me make this bigger. So it says, help wanted, no Irish need apply. So that's what I mean by them trying to shut them out of the labor market. Okay. And then I have the next topic on the study guide is, how did the Irish become white? And so how did the Irish become white? They began to experience slow advancement and the white identity overcame